Hello there, Michael Schillinger, the founder of Synergy. Just taking some time here because I know there's a lot of people that have a lot of questions and are a lot of different stages in understanding the DOL fiduciary rule. So we're going to take some time and try and give you a little insight into how the DOL imposed supervision is germane to your business and the industry as a whole. This isn't so much a solutions presentation. It's more of a gathering of information and insight as to what's going on. This also isn't a sales presentation that a lot of competitors are using to create realignment. And for what it's worth, this presentation is very fluid as there are a lot of elements in the DOL ruling that are still going to play themselves out. We firmly believe that your solution should be aligned with groups that match your values. And just so you know, at Synergy, we like to take the time and effort and energy to educate people and producers objectively on what's going on and what that landscape could look like. So let's start out with a little bit of background that you may or may not have heard of before we get into some of our insight. To start out, the ERISA Act of 1974 was written to protect the retirement assets of Americans by having rules about qualified plans, ensuring the people running those plans are being fiduciaries. It was really written for pensions and making sure that the people running those pensions weren't misusing them. Now, we all know that pensions have all but gone the way of the dinosaur, so to speak, but ERISA still stays in force for all the defined contribution plans that have since become that overwhelming majority spot for the proverbial nest egg. The U.S. Department of Labor and Benefits is the agency that is responsible for the administration of the provisions of the ERISA Act, and it sets the stage for our DOL ruling, so let's talk about some timeline. The DOL having a fiduciary rule is actually nothing new. The original was released in 2010, and it was recently reproposed in 2015. From the articles that I have read, the DOL had a political agenda to go after what they see as misuse and attributed $17 billion in excess fees paid by the individual consumer. Now, that's neither here nor there for our practical discussions because the time to debate and the window to prove your point is gone, and the major opportunity to influence that decision ended in April of 2016 when the DOL released the rule that is 1,023 pages long. To give you an idea, that's about the length of the novel War and Peace. So when you take a look at it being so long, and not to mention they're trying to establish a new way of doing business, there's needless to say a lot of subject open to interpretation. From the second it was released until the second you're looking at this right now, it's still being interpreted, not only by the parties that are opposing it, but also by the people who are preparing to comply by it, even though those may be the same people. Along the way, the people that are enforcing it have designed this period to figuring out how it will be adapted, so we have an applicability date of April 10th, 2017. What this means is that we will be rolling in some way, shape, or form. The landscape will have been changed by that date, and between the initial application date and January 1st, 2018, there's a grace period for all parties involved to work out any kind of processes they need so there's full compliance and adoption by that January 1st, 2018 date. So April 10th, 2017 will mark the date in which distribution sales practices and product creation are going to change with some fluidity from April through the end of the year, and come January 1st, full adoption and liability is on the table for a new normal. To sum up the final ruling, it's seeking to expand the definition of fiduciary in the context of plan creation, product recommendation, and sales practices. It more clearly defines what are prohibited transactions and uses those in effort to eliminate conflicts of interest, or what's also called as self-dealing from an inside perspective. It really truly goes after commission-based products and any outside incentives that can influence sales practices. So what does this rule change mean? Or otherwise said, what's it going to do in practice? Well, in order to sell commission-based products involving retirement plans, you've got to fall underneath an exemption. And the spirit of anything is done with the concept of active managing fiduciary under the prudent standard. You can read along with me, and this is a mouthful, but this is the underlying premise guiding any change. Unsimply put, prudent standard was taken from concept to words as the care, skill, prudence, and diligence under the circumstance then prevailing that a prudent person acting in like capacity and familiar with such matters would use in the conduct of enterprise of like character and like aims based upon the investment objectives, risk tolerance, financial circumstances, and needs of the retirement investor without regard to the financial or other interest. But again, even though it's written out, it's still a concept, so we have to have some elements to abide by. And those elements of valuation focuses on the processes the fiduciary uses to reach its recommendation, and it really goes after objective standard of care in ensuring that there's an investigation and evaluation of all investments prior to recommendation. What it does not go after is the required identification of the quote-unquote best product or hindsight as retribution for any recommendation. So what it goes after more than anything is everything leading up to a sale, and it doesn't allow for subjectivity of either a simplified concept of best product or the ability for someone to look back in time and say, I should have been sold a different product because it performed better than the one that was sold to me. Those latter concepts still have shelter and will continue to have shelter because, let's face it, without hindsight bias, all of that is subjective, so you can only focus on what you can focus on, and that's the processes prior to recommendation. Now, what most people are concerned with is how in the world is this going to change for existing commission-based product versus the level fee-based planning that's available. There's a way that commission-based products are still going to be available, and that way starts through the prohibited transaction exemption. You'll see that called the PTE. The PTE allows an exemption through a process. You can see on the screen here there are 5 elements in the PTE, and we're going to break down some of the new concepts that it brings, but real short and sweet. In order to consider an exempt prohibited transaction, you're going to have to communicate to the client that you're engaging in a fiduciary relationship. You're going to have to adhere to impartial conduct standards, which also creates what we call the best interest contract. You're going to have someone implement policies and procedures to provide prevention of violations of that impartial conduct. You have to refrain from giving or using incentive to induce any kind of recommendation of one product over another, and there has to be full and fair disclosure of all compensation or any other material conflicts of interest associated with the recommendation. This PTE establishes 3 new concepts that we've essentially never seen in this form or fashion before within the current sales process and product development and product distribution. The first of which is who is in charge of overseeing this exemption, and how can the exemption continue to allow commission-based products to be sold. That responsibility is going to fall underneath the supervision of what is now called a financial institution. That financial institution is going to establish a best interest contract between the institution itself and the client, and it's going to carry out the additional suitability programs to be responsible for documentation of not only the transaction but the work leading up to it. It's also going to monitor source of funds and be acting in accordance with ERISA guidelines for qualified funds. If any other changes are come throughout this adoption process, expect the financial institution to be the outlet for oversight. Because they've never existed in the formality concept before, they have to define the financial institution as a registered entity, and that registered entities must be identified in all qualifying sales. Currently, broker-dealers, registered investment advisory firms, banks, and insurance companies can all be considered financial institutions. Quote-unquote other groups, mainly IMOs, will have criteria they can meet in order to be considered a financial institution. These are new elements to the DOL because these elements are necessary to create and facilitate the distribution processes that currently exist. The DOL is currently trying to make rules to identify which concepts, which criteria makes a distribution group eligible for financial institution status and what doesn't. These criteria are currently being developed, and they're not expected to be set out until the first quarter of 2017. This is not really an application acceptance rejection system. It's more of the DOL trying to learn about our industry and how it distributes products and build in certain qualifying criteria in which they feel comfortable allowing people to become a financial institution and supervised based upon those capabilities. No IMO or other group has had an affirmative that they will have status. And there is not anything established that would really allow one IMO to become a financial institution over another as long as everybody meets criteria. So when criteria is met, registration is possible. The financial institution is important in this new world because they are the ones responsible for the best interest contract. And that contract is between the financial institution itself and the client. It is designed to be a clear and prominent single document to address the prudent playing field, giving the client fiduciary protection. It has 3 required elements: the acknowledgement of the fiduciary status in the transaction, adherence to impartial standards, ethical conduct, which includes elements of best interest, adoption of policies and procedures, and disclosures of any conflicts, services, fees, or compensations, and clear contact information for the representative of the financial institution. So in essence, the financial institution is the hub of prudent best interest to the client through the best interest contract. Like any contract, the best interest contract establishes a legal basis with elements that can be enforced upon the client's behalf. Mandatory elements include part of account opening materials, clauses to guarantee arbitration and venue that is not unreasonable to the client, that the contract itself is unilateral, and it carries a waiver of punitive damages. It does not allow elements that would absolve anyone from acting upon fiduciary capacity to waive their liability or try to exclude themselves from class action status. So this best interest contract will be written by the financial institution, signed by the client, and it gives the rules of engagements for methods in which plans are going to be gauged for fiduciary capacity and what happens if the clients feel they have discourse. So now we have a financial institution as the creation of an entity or reformation of existing entities that currently exist in registration capacity. We have the best interest contract, which establishes a unilateral binding contract as to the rules of engagement. And the last element we need to look at is the DOL is trying to ensure best interest through reasonable compensation. The concept of reasonable compensation is not a new thing. They are referring to it within the confines of two codes. But now it's enforceable by the best interest contract and the prohibited transaction exemptions. Reasonableness is going to be measured by market value of service, meaning that really and truly the markets are going to dictate what's reasonable and what's not reasonable. The DOL has not come down and will not come down and say X products should have X commission. Fair market economy is going to do that. The concept of reasonable compensation requires neutral factors so that recommendations are made without conflict of interest, but does not necessarily mean that they have to be level. It can take into account other factors which can influence reasonability, such as complexity of the product and product features. Our goal was to expose you to a couple new concepts that's going to change the way you deal with qualified money. We know this was a lot of information in a very short period of time. And because we truly value education and thoughtful advisors, we put this together knowing it might bring up more questions than answers. To that effect, I want you to know that Synergy is very involved in positioning our industry to continue to thrive in this new environment. We have created a short document that we will continue to update as things change, available for your download at any point in time. Just contact Morgan Marks with the information you see on the screen now to get your access to our Understanding the Fiduciary Rule live document. I hope you appreciated this presentation and the time we've taken to expose you to some new concepts that are going to change the way that everybody operates in the future. If at any point in time you want to have a lengthy discussion, feel free to call, schedule a time. Thanks again, and remember, Synergy is committed to making sure that prudent advisors are going to be able to thrive and survive in the future.